You know, Jim, I've always used the analogy of teaching your children how to drive. And the problem most of us have when we learn how to drive is we tend to oversteer. And yet we've learned after a while that the car naturally goes back and forth between the two white lines. However, if we're now driving on the grass or we're in the other lane and the semi's coming at us, we decide we probably should get back in our lane. And so what we learn through experience is that there's always going to be this natural variation, and as long as we're in those white lines, we know the process is in control, at least as it relates to driving. When we're on the grass or in the other lane with opposing traffic, then we know our process is out of control. And it seems that's an easy way for people to understand the basic concept of process management.
Absolutely.
So do we have another slide here, Jim?
Yes, we have one more slide that we'd like to talk about. And that is that when we look at managing processes, there's some very interesting aspects to it. At one level, we have our internal management. And typically, many of the factors that we look at when we manage internally are controllable. We determine what technology we use, the transformation process. We have some control over the internal environment that the process operates in. So we have many controllable factors that we can look at in terms of the processes. Now, there are many uncontrollable processes or uncontrollable factors too that affect our process. So if we're in the midst of a recession, then that will have a major impact on our ability to be profitable. We didn't control the economy. We contributed to it, but we didn't control it. So there are natural forces, or we did not cause the Gulf spill. But again, we might be impacted in terms of our organizations with that. Now, in addition, there are also there's the collective economy and regulatory. And with those, there is some controllability. We do indirectly or directly vote on our elected leaders. And so they then determine how much regulation and other economic factors that they believe in, that they then pass laws that impact us. So those represent semi-controllable. The key to this process is that we're constantly in an environment where there are things outside our control, there are things that are somewhat controllable, and clearly things that are controllable. And so the future management systems has got to be constantly monitoring each of these and taking the type of actions that are necessary so that we're more adaptive, and as changes occur, we're then able to make different resource allocation decisions than we might have made at other points as each of these factors begins to affect us.
So, Jim, we talk about natural forces, and for example, if you have an oil platform in the Gulf and there a hurricane comes through, most people would say that's probably not controllable, it's uncontrollable. On the other hand, we can still create programs so that if we see a hurricane is coming into the Gulf, that we know we have to remove people from the platforms, we know we have to move people from, shut down the rigs possibly. Likewise, if we understand that the cost of raw materials varies over time, we can create processes to deal with the fact that when prices go high in one raw material, we may be able to substitute other raw materials and still meet the needs of our customer. So even if something is, quote, uncontrollable, there's still ways to look at the process, see how those uncontrollable factors affect the process, and decide how we're going to handle that ahead of time.
Very well said, John. That is one of the major objectives of adaptive management, is to be able to understand what are the natural forces that could affect us, and then turn around and say, what impact could that potentially have on our organizations? So risk is going to be an integral part of the new process management systems of the future. We've got to assess those risks and make a determination, even if something hasn't occurred, if the probability of it occurring is high, and if the impact on our organization is high, then clearly that is something we should be allocating resources to today not just waiting for the natural event to occur.
You know, it's an interesting comment by Alan Greenspan, who was a former head of the Federal Reserve here. He said that most of us focused on the bell curve in the middle range, and what's happened in the last several years is things have occurred at the very tips of the bell curve, and that in the future, as a general statement, he said that we need to look at not only the more standard things that occur, but what happens if something serious happens, like interest rates get affected, credit availability gets affected, there's a shortage of food worldwide, you know, because of rain or lack of rain, locust infestation, things like that, great demand by emerging countries, and we're going to have to look at the effect on processes in a much different way than just what normally occurs in a process.
Absolutely. And to reinforce what you're saying, John, just consider BP and consider the financial meltdown. Both of those, and even Arthur Andersen would be another example. Those were organizations that no one would have thought prior to the events that they would ever have been in economic jeopardy. And almost overnight, those organizations were dramatically impacted by events. So you're absolutely right. We're going to need to manage these, or we're going to pay the price of it.
Well, we'd like to thank you for joining us for our business process management series here, where we talked about what is a business process, what are the components that are different from what people traditionally have done. And in the future series, we will talk about some of the assumptions that people make about processes, and we'll talk about the process laws. So Jim Brimson and myself, John Antos, would like to thank you for watching us, and we hope you'll come back to see our videos on the process laws and process assumptions.